When humanity first reached the stars, it was with hope raw, untamed, and burning bright. Earth had long been a fractured planet, warring over borders, creeds, and colors. But when the void opened up before them, something remarkable happened. Humans united. The stars became not just a new frontier, but a new identity. Earth was no longer the center of everything, it was home. And like all homes, it was something to be defended, remembered, and mourned when lost. The galactic community did not welcome humanity with open arms. At first, humans were dismissed as a curiosity, aggressive, chaotic, emotionally unstable, technologically backward. But that curiosity soon turned to fear. Humans adapted too quickly. Their fleets, crewed by galactic standards, used unpredictable tactics. Their warriors fought with a kind of desperation most species had forgotten. And worst of all, they did not quit. They would die rather than yield. Other empires expanded for profit or ideology. Humanity expanded for survival. Fear turned into hostility. The war didn't start with a declaration. It started with silence trade routes cut, ambassadors recalled, research vessels never returning. And when the first orbital bombardments began, humanity answered with everything it had. Earth was no longer fighting to be part of the galaxy. It was fighting not to be erased from it. For years, the war raged. Colonies burned. Moons were shattered. Stars became graveyards. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, outlasted. The final days of Earth were broadcast across the galaxy as both a warning and a celebration. The Terran defense grid collapsed. The planet was cracked by kinetic strikes, reduced to fire and ash. Survivors were hunted, rounded up, sold. Human children were bartered as exotic pets. Engineers were made to serve in mines and factories. Soldiers were put in arenas. The species that once shook the galaxy became property. To some aliens, this was justice, the punishment of a violent upstart species. To others, it was nothing more than business. But over time, the memory of humanity faded. The surviving humans became fewer with each generation. Slaves were sterilized, beaten, bred without names or histories. Their stories died in silence, and eventually the galaxy forgot. Earth became a myth. Humanity, a word muttered with disdain or amusement. For the humans born in that time, there was no Earth. Only work camps, only chains. They were stripped of language, culture, even the idea that things could be different. A human's purpose was to serve, not to think, not to dream. The stars were no longer a frontier, but a cage. This was the era of chains. In one of the farthest corners of the galaxy, where suns barely shined and imperial patrols were rare, mining colonies were staffed with the lowest of the low humans and other so-called subsapients. These were worlds of dust and fire, where the air was thin and the rules were simple, obey or die. It was here, in the shadows of forgotten stars, that something improbable began, a whisper, a memory, a spark, but long before that spark grew into a flame, humanity endured, bent but not broken, enslaved but not erased, and in the dark, someone remembered. Jace Orlan was born in the mineral pits of Eurothes 9, a backwater mining colony owned by the Cyrex Consortium, an empire known more for cruelty than efficiency. Like every other human in that place, he was born with no rights, no identity, and no future. The overseers didn't call the workers by names, just numbers burned into their skin. Jace's number was 7,246. To them, he was less than a tool, more than a beast, but never a person. Yet even in that wretched environment, the past had not fully died. His mother, Mira, was an old slave, too weak for the mines, but clever enough to have been spared as a data scrubber in the admin quarters. She'd managed to hide a collection of smuggled scraps, old Earth songs encoded in broken audio files, segments of banned human literature, fragments of languages, and maps of a planet most no longer believed had existed. She whispered stories to Jace when he was too young to understand them. Tales of blue skies and oceans that touched the horizon. Stories of men and women who had flown without wings, stood against tyrants, and died for the right to be free. She never said the stories were true, but she never said they weren't. Jace grew up silent, observant. He learned quickly to stay unnoticed by the guards, but even more quickly to read, an illegal skill in the eyes of their masters. While others fought over stale rations, Jace hoarded information. He stole time instead of food. From busted terminals, he learned the structure of the compound, the shift cycles of the Cyrex guards, and even bits of their language. From discarded data pads, he learned of other planets, how ships worked, how systems communicated. And from the scraps his mother left behind, he learned about being human. But what set Jace apart wasn't just knowledge. It was memory, not his own, but the memory of an identity larger than himself. The more he learned, the more he realized what had been taken. Humanity wasn't just a species, it was an idea. A defiant, stubborn, beautiful idea that no one else in the galaxy truly understood. The aliens saw emotion as weakness, unpredictability as danger, dreams as distractions, but Jace saw them for what they were, gifts. The breaking point came when he was 16 cycles old. A young girl, a human barely able to walk, was caught trying to take food from the overseer's quarters. The punishment was swift, public, brutal. Jace was forced to watch along with everyone else. That day, something inside him changed, not just anger, not just grief, something deeper, a decision. He would not die a number. Over the next few years, Jace changed. He began speaking to other slaves, not just humans, but others as well, the insectoid Kate, Ari, the aquatic Bralish, the silicon, born Forun. Most of them had never spoken to a human with interest. Fewer still had seen one speak with confidence, but Jace asked questions, listened, found common ground. All slaves, regardless of species, shared one thing, pain, and from that shared suffering, he began to build something the Cyrex had long thought impossible: trust. He mapped the facility by memory. He found weaknesses in the guards' rotations, supply lines, and communication protocols. He even discovered hidden tunnels once used by ancient mining machines, long since abandoned. Quietly, carefully, he stored weapons. Nothing grand, just tools turned dangerous in the right hands. A broken drill shaft, a pressurized plasma torch, a chain filed to razor edge. Jace didn't just want revenge. He wanted a beginning, a moment, a signal to every slave, every forgotten soul in the dark, that the time of chains was not eternal, that the era of silence would end. And so, in the shadows of Eurothes 9, the last human slave began preparing not for escape, but for war. The plan had no name, no flag, no grand announcement. It started with a single act of refusal. One of the senior Cyrex guards, Commander Thalvren, was known for using humans as examples to maintain control. He was arrogant, cruel, and believed fear was more reliable than chains. During a routine inspection, he targeted an old man, another human slave who had collapsed from exhaustion. Vren demanded that the man get up and work. When he didn't, Vren drew his plasma whip and lashed him across the face. Again and again, Jace stepped forward, not to plead, not to beg, but to block the next strike. Everyone froze. Humans didn't interrupt. They didn't speak unless told. But Jace stood there, eyes unblinking, his body trembling not with fear, but fury. For a moment, Thalvren simply stared, unsure if he was witnessing defiance or madness. Then he raised the whip again. Jace moved first. A buried mining spike from his sleeve found its home in the soft tissue beneath Vren's jaw. The alien collapsed before he could scream. The entire square fell silent. No alarm, no retaliation. Just shock and then panic. The other guards rushed in, but something strange happened. The slaves didn't run. They didn't cry. They moved, precisely as if they had rehearsed, because they had. Stolen explosives took out the perimeter sensors. Hidden tools became weapons. Jace, now stained with alien blood, issued his first command: no more fear. The rebellion on Eurothes 9 began that day, not with fire from the skies, but with blood in the dirt. And it spread, faster than any of the Cyrex overlords could have anticipated. Within days, 2 more mining sectors had fallen. Slave bunkers, once used for containment, became command centers. Drones were reprogrammed, terminals reactivated. Communication channels that had been dead for decades sparked with encrypted messages in dozens of languages. Other species, long oppressed, long divided, began to take notice. For centuries, the alien empires had kept their slaves separate, their histories erased, their cultures diluted. But the uprising led by a single human started to reconnect them. Jace didn't lead as a conqueror. He led as a unifier. He met with K'tari Hive exiles, communicating through hand signals and light pulses, and offered them a voice in the council. He spoke with the Bralish, offering oxygen tank storage in the Rebel, controlled domes in exchange for underwater tunnel maps. Even the Foran, a nearly voiceless silicon race once thought incapable of emotion, joined, building impromptu shielding tech and battlefield defenses out of salvaged ore and scrap. What truly astonished many was how Jace fought, not with overwhelming power, but with strategy, misdirection, sabotage. He didn't seek open war, he sought balance. He knew the rebellion couldn't win through sheer force. The enemy controlled fleets and legions, but they could bleed them dry, cutting lines of supply, spreading misinformation, collapsing key infrastructure. Every victory was small, but deliberate. Every action sent a message. Slaves were not silent anymore. Alien traders began whispering of the ghost of Earth, a human who spoke the ancient tongue and wielded the long, lost fury of his people. Children in slums drew the ghost's face in the dust. Workers sang forbidden Earth songs during shifts. The rebellion, though still small, had become contagious. For the Cyrex Consortium and the empires aligned with it, this was unthinkable. Slaves were manageable, predictable. They didn't organize, they didn't plan, they didn't remember, but this one did, and in him, others began to remember too, not just what they were, but what they could be. Jace Orlan didn't just spark a rebellion. He rekindled something far more dangerous, hope. The rebellion had no central fleet, no capital planet, and no government, but it had reach. What began in the mines of Eurothes 9 spread to industrial colonies, agricultural slave, worlds, and even penal orbitals. Jace Orlan's name became a code word passed between work camps and trading outposts. The ghost of Earth is coming, they would whisper, and with that whisper came the fire. But as the movement grew, so did the response. The Cyrex Consortium, humiliated by the loss of an entire sector, launched their first wave of retaliation fleets. Heavy cruisers equipped with orbital plasma lances began glassing suspected rebel hideouts. Whole moons were declared contaminated and sterilized by orbital bombardment. Species that had shown sympathy toward the humans were sanctioned or outright invaded. The rebellion's enemy wasn't just the Cyrex anymore. It was the entire galactic status quo, and Jace knew it. He adapted. His strikes became surgical, his sabotage even more devastating. On the orbital smelter, world of Kervac 3, a dozen rebels shut down planetary fusion generators, plunging the entire hemisphere into a blackout. On the slave factory moons of Threlvos, they hacked transport AI, rerouting war resources directly into vacuum. Each time the enemy reacted, the rebels learned. Every overreach by the empires exposed cracks, logistical dependencies, political fractures, interspecies rivalries. But it wasn't just about strategy. Jace was building something larger, something that couldn't be burned away with plasma. He started recording broadcasts, short at first, encrypted messages carried across black market bandwidths, telling stories not of battle, but of dignity, of what it meant to be free, of why the chains had to be broken not just for humans, but for everyone. The speeches were translated into over 50 dialects, with symbols and visual cues for species that couldn't hear or see in human wavelengths. His words reached not just slaves, but free citizens too. Aliens who had long ignored the atrocities on the Outer Rim suddenly began to question what they had accepted as normal. Galactic historians later called it the War of Shadows, not because it was unseen, but because it was a war of belief. A battle not just for territory, but for narrative. Jace never stayed in one place long. He moved between hidden rebel fleets, Terracamo outposts, and ancient underground bunkers repurposed as bases. Wherever he went, he listened, he asked questions, he made sure the rebellion didn't become a human war. That was the trap the empires hoped for, that he'd try to make humanity the new rulers, but Jace refused it. "We're not here to become new masters," he once said in a closed council. "We're here to end the idea that anyone belongs to anyone else." This philosophy made the rebellion harder to crush. It wasn't centralized. There was no throne to decapitate. Leaders emerged organically. Kate, Ari strategists, browlish engineers, even former merchant Cast Varnak, who defected and shared critical trade secrets. It became a movement of the broken, the outcast, the disposable. And it worked. By the third year of the rebellion, major Cyrex production lines were in shambles. Their war fleets were overextended, forced to patrol dozens of systems that once maintained themselves through slavery. Economies reliant on unpaid labor began to collapse. Civil unrest erupted on core worlds where the elite were forced to face the reality of how fragile their luxury truly was. And still, the rebellion didn't seek conquest. That was the most terrifying part. They didn't want empires. They didn't want revenge in the form of domination. They wanted liberation. They wanted to burn the old order down and leave no throne in its place. The rulers of the galaxy began to realize that the rebellion could no longer be dismissed as terrorism or disobedience. This was something new, something ancient, something that had once existed and been crushed, but now had returned stronger, wiser, and impossible to silence. They feared many things, but above all, they feared that others would start to believe. It was meant to be a humiliation, an execution broadcast live across the galactic net, meant to silence the rebellion once and for all. Jace Orlan had been captured during a deep infiltration mission on a heavily fortified logistics station orbiting the gas giant Tyrol 4. The mission had succeeded. Half of the region's fuel depots were destroyed, crippling Cyrex fleet movements for months. But Jace stayed behind to cover the retreat. His team escaped. He did not. They didn't kill him immediately. The Cyrex High Command realized the symbol they had in their custody, the ghost of Earth. The last pureblood human born into slavery who had not only escaped but lit a fire that spread across half the galaxy. They paraded him through their capital like a trophy, dragging him in chains through the streets of Icarus Prime while billions watched. They allowed media feeds from all corners of the known systems to stream the event. They invited every major species news corps to witness what they believed would be the final chapter in a failed insurrection. Before the execution, the Cyrex granted him a last request, a final statement. They expected a rant, a desperate plea, perhaps even a sputtering cry for forgiveness. What they got instead would ripple through history like a thunderclap. Standing on the execution platform, bruised and bloodied, Jace looked out across the crowd, not just those physically gathered, but the trillions watching from orbitals, slave barracks, data streams, and darkened rooms. 1,000 cameras focused on him. Around his neck hung the broken shackles of Eurothes 9, rusted with age and defiance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You called us animals. He began quietly because we fought back. You said we were inferior because we felt too deeply, loved too fiercely, remembered too much, but I remember what you fear. I remember Earth. The crowd murmured. The name of the lost human homeworld hadn't been spoken publicly in decades. I remember a planet where children were taught to question everything, even the stars, where no tyrant ruled forever, where revolutions burned through palaces like fire through dry grass. You destroyed our world because you feared what we stood for. You didn't erase us. You scattered us like seeds. The Cyrex guards shifted uncomfortably. The presiding official moved to cut the feed, but their communications systems began to falter. Across dozens of worlds, encrypted rebel signals hijacked civilian and military channels alike. Every screen, every feed, every port terminal flickered and showed only him. You built empires on the backs of the forgotten, but now we remember, not just humans, Kaitari, Brelish, Forun, Varnak, even some of your own. You taught us to hate each other so we'd never look up at the hand holding the leash. He stepped forward. No shackles could stop the gravity in his voice. I am not asking you to free us. I'm telling you that you can't stop us anymore. You can kill me, but you can't kill what we've become. You can burn my body, but you'll never burn the idea that we were born free, that no one belongs in chains, that the future doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to the brave. Some of the alien officials shouted for the feed to be cut. Others ordered guards to remove him, but it was too late. Across the galaxy, systems were crashing under the flood of data. People were recording, repeating, translating, and sending his words faster than they could be suppressed. Jace turned to the camera one final time. You made me a slave, then you made me a soldier. Now you've made me something else entirely, a spark, and sparks make fire. And with that, the image cut, but his words did not. They echoed, on mining moons where the enslaved began to strike down their masters, on trade hubs where merchants refused to transport goods built on suffering, on pleasure worlds where citizens, drunk on luxury, began to march for change, on warships where captains ordered mutinies and turned their weapons around. The Cyrex called it treason. The galaxy called it awakening. They executed Jace Orlan the next morning. There was no audience this time, no broadcast. The Cyrex realized too late that showing his death would only immortalize him further. They tried to make it quiet, clinical, like erasing a file from a terminal. No monument, no last rites, no body returned. Just an empty report sent to their military archives. Subject 7002, 146 terminated, movement destabilized, order projected to be restored, but the Cyrex didn't understand the nature of what they had created. Jace's final words, spread across the stars, had already transcended him. His death was not the end of the rebellion. It was its catalyst. Within days, the largest coordinated uprising in galactic history ignited across 12 sectors. Rebel cells, many of which had never communicated before, rose in unison. It was as if every downtrodden soul in the galaxy had heard the same silent command, now. The planets once viewed as slave backwaters became war zones of liberation. At the forged worlds of Daskala, the Bralish flooded the reactor cores, sending molten steel through the Overseer barracks. On the ocean moons of Telvuran, foreign shock squads breached deep-water facilities using improvised tunneling drills built from mining scrap. Entire space stations disappeared as defected engineers programmed their own destruction. Even within the Cyrex consortium, cracks turned into chasms. Some of the outer colonies, those that had grown dependent on human labor or trade with rebel-friendly species, refused orders to send reinforcements. Others declared neutrality. One by one, the support systems of the galactic ruling class began to fall apart. And amidst the chaos, one phrase began to appear everywhere. He was the last slave. There will be no more. Jace Orlan became a martyr, but more than that, he became a symbol of an identity that could not be extinguished. Statues of him began appearing in secret holographic carvings on derelict freighters, murals painted on shattered orbital walls. He was never shown as a conqueror or king, but as a man, standing tall, dirty, unbroken, eyes fixed on the stars. In every version of his likeness, one detail never changed: the broken shackles hanging from his wrists. Schools were founded in his name, not just to teach humans, but to teach anyone who had been born into servitude or silence. These were not places of indoctrination, but of memory, memory of what had been lost and what had been reclaimed, and humanity, once thought extinct or irrelevant, began to rise again, not as a dominating force, but as a cultural spark. The species once considered chaotic, irrational, and dangerous was now seen in a new light. Unpredictable, yes, but also courageous, defiant, and resilient in ways the other empires had long forgotten how to be. Some called it the human renaissance, others called it the rebirth of fire. On worlds once silent, music returned. Stories once banned were told again, not just in human languages, but in the tongues of every species that had joined the cause. Some of them were rewritten, adapted, transformed, but their heart remained the same. The message that Jace carried had crossed the boundaries of biology, of culture, of time. And far out beyond the former edges of the known galaxy, new colonies were seeded, worlds where no one would rule through fear, where names were not numbers, where history would not be erased again. These were not human colonies. They were free colonies. The old flags were gone. In their place were symbols of unity, a flame, a broken chain, a human hand extended not in conquest, but in invitation. Jace Orlan had not lived to see this future, but his story had shaped it. In every liberated world, it is said that the last words spoken before tearing down the final banner of the old regime are always the same: we were slaves once, never again.